foundation is the Charter of the United Nations. If everyone follows its letter and spirit, then the United Nations is capable of overcoming current divergences and to reach a common denominator on most issues. The end of history did not take place. Let's work together in the interests of the beginning of history of true multilateralism that reflects all the richness of the cultural and civilizational diversity of the peoples of the world. I invite everyone to a frank discussion. Of course, it has to be an honest one. Thank you very much.
I resume my function as the President of the Council, and I now give the floor to Federal Councillor and Head of the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs of Switzerland, His Excellency Mr. Ignacio Cassis.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, Excellencies, dear colleagues, a more just, more democratic, and more sustainable world order is one that places freedom at its heart. Yet history shows us that there is no such thing as absolute freedom. While freedom is essential for living in society, it is only guaranteed when it is protected by rules. Rules of principle and rules of law. The right to freedom cannot exist without duty and responsibility. More than 75 years ago, when we adopted the United Nations Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we drew lessons from the history of the first half of the 20th century, and particularly the two world wars. These universal standards made it possible to build a world in which the force of law would eventually prevail over the law of force. And it is in particular the prohibition of the use of force, a genuine paradigm shift in international law, when the world previously believed in the idea of a just war, that was placed at the heart of our charter. Since the adoption of the charter, we, the peoples of the United Nations, have stone by stone built the foundations of our universal commitments. And we have tried together to build a better world, one with less poverty, controlled epidemics, humanitarian assistance for those in need. Many of us were bathed in an optimism fueled by the spirit of never again. When the Berlin Wall came down, we believed that the ideals based on the principle of the Charter would take hold once and for all. But we must admit that we have not been able to stay the course. Our optimism clashed against the merciless wall of realism. And yet, we know history is not linear, and that human beings have an unfortunate tendency to repeat the same mistakes. Protectionism, nationalism, symptoms of this global malaise illustrate a gigantic lack of trust between humans. Wars, poverty, misinformation, and geopolitical visions that are difficult to reconcile are gaining ground all over the world. Ukraine, for example, has been devastated by military aggression for over 2 years in flagrant violation of the Charter. For more than a year, Sudan has once again been in the grip of a civil war. And, ladies and gentlemen, 75 years of multilateral engagement have yet to bring peace to the Middle East. Yes, multilateralism is ailing. If the United Nations seems too weak to us today, it is because it reflects the too little willingness on the part of all member states to obey the law of duty that they have voluntarily subjected themselves to. We must regain the momentum that has held our community together for so long. Mr. President, in May 2023, in this very chamber, I chaired a debate on the role of trust between states. Trust is a key element if this council is to fulfill its mandate. To build trust, we need to seek out more dialogue, especially when there are divisions. Seeking out and creating dialogue sometimes requires creativity and risk-taking. When we organized an international conference on peace in Ukraine a month ago, our aim was precisely to build trust through dialogue. In Switzerland, for 2 days, around 100 delegations discussed possible paths to peace. By no means did we all agree on these paths to peace, but we tried to establish a basis of trust on which to move forward. And we are providing a forum for other discussions, such as the one currently taking place on Sudan under the auspices of the UN Geneva, or the one that took place earlier in the context of Yemen. As the depositary of the Geneva Convention, Switzerland is ready to shoulder its responsibilities to achieve a world order based on humanitarian law. As we commemorate the 75th anniversary of the Geneva Conventions next month, and I hope to welcome you all to Switzerland for this important commemoration, it is high time to reaffirm the universal validity of international humanitarian law. At the end of October, Switzerland will host the 34th International Conference of the Red Cross and Red Crescent in Geneva. Under the motto, Managing Uncertainty, Strengthening Humanity, the aim of this conference is to improve humanitarian response through effective dialogue. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, faced with an increase in wars and the systematic use of violence, we need to believe in respect for international humanitarian law. While trust can be created through dialogue, it can also be created through a change of perspective. As a doctor by training, I believe in science and scientific diplomacy. I'm convinced that science can help strengthen the efficiency of our work. An approach based on scientifically established facts also strengthens mutual trust. It makes it possible to anticipate risks and opportunities for peace. During our presidency of the Council in October of this year, we will be proposing a meeting on the potential of science diplomacy. Dear colleagues, it is up to us, the members of this Council, to live up to the responsibility that we have been entrusted, whether by the General Assembly or by the history of our common humanity. I thank you. I thank His Excellency, Mr. Ignacio Cassis, and I give the floor to the Director of the Department of Multilateral and Global Affairs, Ministry for Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation, and Ambassador to the Caribbean Community of Guyana, His Excellency, Mr. George Talbot.
Mr. President, Excellencies, I thank the Russian Federation for convening today's open debate and welcome the opportunity for collective introspection and frank assessment of multilateral cooperation in the interest of a more just, democratic, and sustainable world order. In Guyana's view, such an order is exactly what was envisaged when the United Nations Charter was crafted. The critical ingredients can be found in the preamble to the Charter. A world free from the scourge of war. One where there is respect for fundamental human rights and the dignity and worth of the human person. Where men and women and nations large and small enjoy equal rights. Where there is justice and respect for international law, and the obligations flowing therefrom, and a world that fosters for all peoples better standards of life in larger freedom. The United Nations Charter, embodying as it does the fundamental principles of the multilateral ethos, has served as a framework and guide for the achievement of these objectives. It enjoins a sense of common purpose, a spirit of solidarity, and of inclusion. No country or people is to be left behind. As sovereign equals, every state deserves a seat at the table of global discourse. Each voice needs to be heard and respected, and each contribution valued. In the words of Guyana's most celebrated poet, Martin Carter, I quote, "All are involved, all are consumed," unquote. Small developing countries such as my own attach the highest value to an effective, democratic, responsive, and inclusive multilateral system, and to the primacy of the rule of international law. Our security, our very survival depends on this. In working to adapt the global architecture to the demands of the 21st century, the enduring relevance and validity of the purposes and principles of the UN Charter cannot be overstated. However, too often are they honored in the breach. It is incumbent on the Security Council, charged with the primary responsibility for maintaining international peace and security, and by extension its member states, to be exemplary in their adherence to the Charter and to eschew any conduct that is inimical to the Council's mandate. But no state is exempt in this regard. States must therefore hold themselves and each other to the highest standards of performance and accountability in observance of the Charter and international law. Mr. President, as we have seen in the cases of Ukraine and Gaza, breaches of the peace can have consequences well beyond the immediate theater of operations. The Security Council must take active cognizance of these realities and, in concert with the broader international community and regional organizations, be more proactive in addressing the drivers of conflict. Greater attention to prevention and to the pacific settlement of disputes, as provided in Chapter 6 of the Charter, is imperative. Parties to disputes must be persuaded to seek solutions utilizing the means outlined in Article 33 of the Charter, including negotiation, mediation, arbitration, and judicial settlement. Too often is there recourse to the threat or use of force. The result is an increasing number of armed conflicts in our world today that continue to destroy lives and threaten the future of states. This is compounded by a lack of respect for international humanitarian law. In reaffirming the principle of non-interference in internal affairs, we cannot turn a blind eye to egregious violations. Members of the Security Council should not be among those undermining the judicial institutions of the United Nations, so crucial to ensuring respect for the rule of law and promoting accountability. Mr. President, the thrust towards a more just, democratic, and sustainable world order will of necessity entail institutional reform, not least of the Security Council, arguably the least representative of global institutions. The Council must be made more representative, democratic, and accountable. For Guyana, no reform would be complete without enhanced participation of small states, who, for the most part, are a force for peace and principle. Moreover, the multidimensional and interlocking threats and challenges of today require greater cooperation, complementarity, and coherence of effort across UN organs, international machinery, and member states. We must broaden our frame of reference and expand our toolkit to deal with the new threats that have evolved, such as those posed by climate change, cyber attacks, AI, disease, etc. Likewise, in the use of available resources to better address interlinked pursuits, such as between prevention and peace building and development and poverty eradication. Just a fraction of the vast resources dedicated to implements of war and destruction would more than suffice for the fight against poverty or hunger or disease or the combat of climate change. Indeed, for the promotion of sustainable peace in our world. Finally, on the question of trust among member states, within the Security Council, or wherever, this question is not new, nor is the answer. Trust is ultimately based on performance, the honoring of commitments, the assumption of responsibilities, the discharge of obligations. It is fostered by promoting real understanding and dialogue. Across the multitude of commitments, undertakings, and obligations, whether in the UN Charter, the 2030 Agenda, the Paris Agreement, or in the many other instruments, resolutions, and declarations adopted by these United Nations or beyond, a credibility gap exists that must be closed. I end, Mr. President, as the Charter begins. We the peoples. Their trust, their hopes, their aspirations, their expectations are ultimately what matters most. It must be acknowledged that the adversarial nature of contemporary politics makes it impossible to fulfill our global commitments and meet the expectations of our people. States must demonstrate by their actions that they are reliable and trustworthy partners committed to working together for the greater good of all. I thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Talbot for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Mr. President, Excellencies, first I thank Russia for organizing this open debate, and I thank His Excellency Sergei Lavrov for coming from Moscow to chair this important meeting. Excellencies, this debate is very timely. Timely because our Council continues to struggle to find solutions to too many conflicts and crises, including in Palestine, where genocide is being committed as we speak. I hope this debate will help our Council to be more effective and less polarized. Mr. President, multilateral cooperation is not something new. There were instances of multilateralism through military alliances, treaties, and trade routes in the Mediterranean region and elsewhere during ancient times. While this may not fit the modern definition of multilateral cooperation, it illustrates the idea of various entities coming together for common purposes. Today, we cannot imagine a world without multilateral cooperation. It is essential for addressing complex global issues that no single country can solve alone. It also allows governments to pool resources, share knowledge, and develop joint solutions. As Council's members, this is precisely what we try to do every time we enter this chamber. Mr. President, multilateral cooperation faces multiple challenges. This requires the UN to adapt to emerging realities with multiple centers of power and to enhance its role in establishing a just, democratic, and sustainable international order. My delegation firmly believes that reforming the Security Council would increase the legitimacy of this UN organ. In this regard, expanding the Council's membership and prioritizing the historical injustice done to Africa will be a milestone. The open debate that will be held next month under the Sierra Leone presidency will allow us to discuss this issue further. In the meantime, the IGN's contribution to the Pact of the Future is an important step in the right direction. We thank the IGN's co-chairs, the permanent representative of Austria and Kuwait. Mr. President, regarding the opportunities we shall not miss, first and foremost, we have the 2030 Agenda. It represents a universal framework that addresses poverty, environmental degradation, and economic inequalities. And let's not forget that this agenda calls for the full realization of the right to self-determination of people living under colonial and foreign occupation. With less than 1/5 of the target on track, the world is failing to deliver on the SDGs promise. Urgent actions is needed. Excellencies, Algeria believes that to reestablish an atmosphere of trust in the UN, and in particular with this Council, we require more efforts to foster mutual respect, transparency, inclusivity, and openness. To that end, we must abide by and prioritize diplomacy and dialogue, transparency, mutual understanding, peaceful settlement of disputes. We also need to give priority to conflict prevention and peace building by addressing the root causes. Last but not the least, we need to uphold international law and the UN Charter as guiding principles. We must ensure that the Council's decisions and actions adhere to these principles and contribute to global peace and stability. Our compass shall be avoiding the selective application of international law. Dear colleagues, as the Summit of the Future approach, let's work to make this event a real Summit of the Future, not a Summit of the past. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for a statement, and I give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. The world of 2024 looks very different to the world of 1945, but the challenges we face are no less stark. More countries globally are engaged in conflicts than at any time since the Second World War. We're facing a climate crisis, and scientific and technological breakthroughs are raising new questions which we need to answer. A UN fit for the 21st century is vital to meet these challenges. I'd like to make 3 points. First, we need reinvigorated systems that are more inclusive and more responsive to deliver on these important priorities, including the Sustainable Development Goals and international financial architecture reform. That is why the UK is committed to making a success of the Summit of the Future in September and realising its potential to set a new, ambitious course for the UN. We also recognise that members sitting around this table need to be more representative of the world today, and that is why we have long supported Security Council reform. Second, we need to ensure that this Council delivers on its mandate to uphold international peace and security. We regret that recent Council resolutions 2735 and 2736, calling for a ceasefire deal in Gaza and de-escalation in and around El Fasher in Sudan, have yet to be fully implemented. We call on all parties to do their utmost to see these resolutions implemented to prevent further human suffering. We as Council members also have a responsibility to uphold our own commitments. It is therefore vital that the Russian government stops sourcing weapons from DPRK in violation of UN Security Council resolutions and stops its attempts to disrupt UN work in Africa, including by stopping Russian proxies' targeted actions against MINUSCA. Third, we must defend the UN Charter. President, while you tell us how you believe the world order can become more just, democratic, and sustainable, your military is systematically bombing civilians in Ukraine in an unprovoked war of aggression and in flagrant violation of the UN Charter. What is just about trying to annex another country's land? What is democratic about trying to subjugate another country's people? What is sustainable about waging a war that has killed or injured over 500,000 of your own people? The war in Ukraine is a stark reminder of what kind of world order Russia really wants. A world where might is right and powerful countries can bully and invade others with impunity. The UK will not accept such a world. We will continue to stand staunchly behind Ukraine. We will support its aspiration for a just and lasting peace in line with the UN Charter and international law, and its demand for accountability. We will continue to be a tireless advocate for effective multilateralism and for the principles at the heart of the UN Charter. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom, and I give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank you for convening this timely debate on multilateral cooperation in the interest of a more just, democratic, and sustainable world order. Sierra Leone welcomes the debate not only in view of the forthcoming 80th anniversary of the United Nations, the most essential multilateral institution of our time, but also because it offers the opportunity to rethink and reshape our cooperation framework on the basis of equity, democracy, and sustainability. Today, more than ever, our collective efforts are essential in navigating the complexities of our interconnected world. The challenges we face, ranging from climate change to global health crisis, from conflicts to economic inequalities, are beyond the capacity of any single nation to resolve. They demand a robust, coordinated, and inclusive multilateral approach. Currently, the 193 member states of the United Nations, from diverse regions and cultures, evoke a strong statement of recognition by member states of the importance of the multilateral system founded on international law to safeguard the sovereignty and independence of states and to advance and defend common and critical interests. We should therefore resolve to use this unity in diversity to achieve the purposes of the organization, to maintain international peace and security, promote and protect fundamental human rights, and cooperate to achieve sustainable development. Presently, we are, however, challenged to generate innovative ideas and credible mechanisms that will bring all conflict to a peaceful end, maintain peace and security, promote social progress, human rights and fundamental freedoms, and secure better standards of life for humanity. We have limited options or any other alternative other than to strengthen multilateralism based on the UN Charter and international law to address these challenges. This Council should, in this regard, reflect on reform measures that will reinforce our collective obligation to uphold the purposes and principles upon which our organization was founded as enshrined in the UN Charter. We cannot champion a just, democratic, and sustainable world when Africa, a continent on which more than half of the discussions of the Security Council are based, remains excluded in the permanent category and underrepresented in the non-permanent category in the organ with primary responsibility and binding decision powers on matters of international peace and security. The historical injustice against Africa must be redressed, and we look forward to the debate on this important issue during Sierra Leone's presidency of the Security Council in August. There is a binding commitment to build a global society that is more just, inclusive, and equal than the one we live in today. Accordingly, we must be committed to supporting and facilitating multilateral cooperation in the interests of a just, democratic, and sustainable world, with the United Nations at the center. Therefore, respecting the prohibition on the use of force, preserving and strengthening the values of peaceful settlement of dispute, upholding the dignity of humanity and meaningful sustainable economic development through international cooperation as enshrined in the UN Charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and reaffirmed in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, are essential to promote and support the three pillars of the United Nations. Mr. President, on the basis of the foregoing, let me highlight 4 key points. First and importantly, a just world requires an unwavering commitment to the rule of law. Respect for and upholding international law and the rule of law at the international level is a sine qua non, as it is self-evident that for multilateralism to be sustained and strengthened, it is imperative that states abide by their obligations under the UN Charter and international law, eschewing selective application of the law. To strengthen multilateralism through international law and the rule of law, states are also urged to use or continue to use international courts, in particular the International Court of Justice, as a potential tool to address shared interests of international concern. This could be seen as the application of international law to multilateralism, thereby ensuring justice and accountability in solving legal disputes. The judicial settlement of dispute in a way giving expression to Article 2, Paragraph 3, and Article 33 of the UN Charter, and reinforcing the rule of international law. Secondly, a democratic world order should be centered around the principles of transparency, accountability, and inclusive participation. Democracy is not merely a system of governance, but a foundation upon which the principle of sovereign equality of states rests. Support for democratic practices and transparent processes at the international level allows for inclusive participation and ownership, and thereby putting an end to the paradigm of inequality, inequities, as well as safeguarding against the erosion of democratic tenet of sovereign equality. It is imperative for pluralism to be reinforced, allowing for the voices of all actors in international relations to be heard. Thirdly, we acknowledge that sustainability is the bedrock of a world order that promises longevity and prosperity for future generations. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Paris Agreement on Climate Change provide us the blueprint. Additionally, the Summit of the Future affords us the opportunity at the highest level to outline an ambitious agenda, not only to forge a new international consensus, but also to establish a new global agreement on multilateral solutions with a commitment to deliver a better present and safeguard the future. We must thus accelerate our efforts to combat climate change, promote sustainable development, and protect our planet's biodiversity. This includes fostering innovation in green technologies, enhancing global cooperation on environmental issues, meaningful capacity development and transfer of technology, and ensuring that economic growth does not come at the expense of our planet's health. Fourthly, it is imperative to highlight the role of the Bretton Woods institutions, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, in creating a just, fair, and sustainable world. These institutions were established to promote international economic cooperation and stability. However, as the global economic landscape has evolved, so too must these institutions. We must ensure that their policies and practices are aligned with the principles of equity, sustainability, and democratic governance. They must assist states and government to deliver on their social contracts. Their programs must not drive a wedge between citizens and their government, exacerbating tensions that may exist. A pressing issue that requires our immediate attention is the burden of debt on developing nations. Many countries are trapped in a cycle of debt that stifle their development prospects and exacerbate poverty and inequality. Debt cancellation and comprehensive debt treatment are not just economic necessities, but means to address some of the root causes of conflicts. By providing debt relief, we enable these nations to invest in health, education, infrastructure, and sustainable development, thereby fostering global stability and prosperity. Debt sustainability should be a cornerstone of our multilateral effort. We must work towards a fair and transparent international sovereign lending and debt architecture that prevents future debt crises and ensure that borrowing is managed responsibly. This includes promoting responsible lending and borrowing practices, enhancing debt transparency, and developing mechanisms for fair and orderly debt restructuring. Mr. President, in pursuit of these goals, multilateralism is our most powerful tool. The United Nations, with its unique legitimacy and convening power, must be at the forefront of fostering international cooperation. We must reform and reinvigorate our multilateral institutions to be more effective, representative, and responsive to the needs of all member states. This includes addressing disparities in global governance structures and ensuring equitable representation for developing countries, especially Africa. Our collective resolve to enhance our multilateral cooperation must be the immediate necessity. Our inaction will have a debilitating effect on the dignity of humanity. In that regard, Sierra Leone reiterates its commitment to the principles, ideals, and objectives of the UN Charter. In closing, Mr. President, let me say that the challenges of our times are formidable, but they are not insurmountable. By embracing multilateral cooperation, we can create a world that is more just, democratic, and sustainable. Let us reaffirm our commitment to these principles and work towards, together, to build a future that reflects.
בן 32 היה בנופלו. יחד איתו נפלו סרן צביקה קפלן וסמל ראשון מושיקו אסנקו מלאקו, זכרם לברכה. עשור חלף ושוב הגיעו המבשרים אל סף ביתה של דינה ואמרו, הם הודיעו לה כי בנה עידן, טנקיסט בחטיבה 188, נפצע באורח קשה בקרב בדרום הרצועה. עידן איבד את רגלו, עבר ניתוחים מורכבים, והוא ממשיך במאבקו לחזור לשגרת חייו. את המשימה
around the world, such as the war in Ukraine, the Gaza crisis, and DPRK's repeated violations of Security Council resolutions. It is often argued that the UN and multilateralism have become futile. It is truly frustrating that in practice, the UN indeed was designed to be powerless in case a permanent member of the Security Council uses force in violation of the UN Charter and is determined to get away with it. However, this does not mean that we should give up on the UN or multilateralism. Dear colleagues, even without binding decisions, the United Nations, in particular the Security Council, still provides a valuable platform to exchange views among member states and construct the right narrative for the international community. The United Nations can serve as a megaphone that sends out clear messages toward the global audience that the violation of the UN Charter by any member states is unacceptable, thereby ultimately thwarting the ambitions of violators and guiding us in the right direction. In our view, this enduring multilateral diplomatic space is even more relevant in the deepening skepticism and chaos we face today. Against this backdrop, I'd like to highlight the following points. First, diversity must be fostered in a manner that promotes universal values. In addressing global challenges, it is critical to respect different histories, cultures, levels of economic development, and different political systems. We should always honestly listen to each other and deepen our mutual understanding. However, we should also be reminded that we are, after all, the same kind, the one humanity, even amid conflicts, wars, and extreme hate towards one another. The essence of the humanity we share transcends all other differences in culture, politics, and history. Likewise, fundamental and universal values are non-negotiable and must be upheld under any circumstances. For instance, the reported public execution of dozens of teenage students in North Korea last week for watching South Korean dramas, and the sentencing of hard labor to North Koreans for preparing their meal with bottled rice that South Korean NGOs sent over for humanitarian purposes, are simply intolerable. Such brutal acts by the regime cannot and must not be explained or understood in terms of any diversity or differences in governance. It makes no sense to preach diversity while undermining our shared universal values. Second, we should preserve and effectively utilize the multilateral tools that the UN has developed for decades and are now at our disposal. Among many, UN peace operations remain a central component in the continuum of UN responses to maintain peace and security. We strongly call for full support for these missions, both in terms of mandates and resources, to better protect civilians, prevent conflicts, establish the rule of law, and promote human rights. As mentioned in the Secretary General's new agenda for peace, the UN Security Council sanctions regimes also remain an important UN Charter instrument to address threats to international peace and security. Sanctions should be more targeted and effective, minimizing unintended humanitarian impacts. At the same time, we need to ensure that sanctions measures are effective enough to achieve their intended goal, bearing in mind that every sanctions regime has its own history and background. Undermining sanctions regimes without good reasons or for self-serving purposes, including the monitoring mechanism, can only further complicate and destabilize situations. In this connection, Russia's single-handed dissolution of the panel of experts on DPRK sanctions in April demonstrated how grave violations of Security Council resolutions by a permanent member, such as the trading of arms with North Korea, can result in the destruction of an indispensable Security Council institution. One lie leads to another, and one crime leads to another. Colleagues, this brings us to my next point. that accountability for decisions and agreements must be ensured. The concept note for today's meeting asks us whether the international order should be founded on a polycentric or a unipolar paradigm. But in our view, this question is about how we analyze an existing phenomenon, not a matter of choice. Whether we are living in a multipolar world or not, what matters is that we realize sustaining peace from it. We have seen the consequences of the multipolar order, or rather disorder, of the 1920s and 30s. It is our common goal not to let such history repeat itself. One way to achieve this goal is to ensure that the United Nations